Delighted to see you all here. My name is Susan Holman, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this online panel discussion and public colloquium, Conversations in Religion and the Healing Arts. This event is sponsored by the John R. Eckrich Chair in Religion and the Healing Arts here at Valparaiso University and by Christ College, the university's Honors College. During the next 90 minutes, we're going to hear from 3 scholars in religion and health from around the world who will share from their research and engage in cross-disciplinary reflections about the intersections of religion and health today. This session is being recorded and it will be available later online. The study and practice of religion and spirituality have connected through history in many different ways with medicine, public and global health, healthcare delivery, disability ethics and bioethics, social determinants of health, and health disparities. Faith-based responses to human and environmental crises are shaped by social constructions of illness and wellness. These constructions typically draw on historical perspectives and theologies of the body. The fields of medicine and public health, in turn, serve populations for whom religious identity is often a vital ingredient in defining wellness. These multiple connections raise important questions. For instance, what does it mean to respect religious traditions in healthcare? What models or ethical perspectives may help scholars, persons of faith, and health professionals sensitively integrate belief and practice? How can evidence-based data and historical voices together encourage positive synergies? And how do religion, spirituality, and modern concerns about global health and wellness across boundaries shape what some might call a creaturely theology of environment and cosmos? These are just a few of the many questions we might ask in conversations about religion and the healing arts. Our speakers today approach such questions through the lenses of 3 very different topics. Their presentations will explore religion-health connections through, first, the rhetoric of infection and contagion in light of COVID-19 and Christian history. Second, congregational partnerships in underserved and economically challenged neighborhoods in the United States. And third, and finally, in the science of human flourishing, with a focus on new data on neurobiology and spiritual health. A few words about logistics. Each panelist will present for about 15 minutes, followed by a time for interactive conversations among the speakers. Depending on time, we will then turn to select written questions from the audience submitted through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. You may direct your written questions to the moderators and name which panelist your question is for. Please keep your questions brief. The chat will be saved so that even if we can't get to every question, they will all be available to the panelists. Such questions may also help build forward future conversations on this important topic. You can also direct comments or suggestions following the event to me, Susan Holman, here at Valparaiso University. As good computer etiquette, we ask everyone in the audience to please keep your microphones mute. You may turn your cameras on, if you're comfortable with that, to help foster a personable and visually engaged welcoming space for all. And now I'm going to introduce our 3 panelists and turn it over to them one by one for their presentations. Our first speaker, Anna Rebecca Solevåg, is Professor of New Testament Studies at VID Specialized University in Stavanger, Norway, where she directs the PhD program in theology and religion. Her research explores the intersections of gender, class, disability, age, and ethnicity, and the complexities of identity and power negotiations that take place at these crossroads. Her publications include 2 books, Negotiating the Disabled Body, Representations of Disability in Early Christian Texts, published by SBL Press in 2018, and Birthing Salvation, Gender and Class in Early Christian Childbearing Discourse, published by Brill in 2013. Dr. Solevåg will speak to us on medical knowledge and religious conviction in the midst of a pandemic.
Thank you for this introduction. Hello, everybody. It's very nice to be with you today. I'm being helped with my PowerPoint, so we can start my PowerPoint, and then we can get going. Let's see. So we can, as soon as the show starts, we can move on to the next slide. So, one of the questions that the Valparaiso Conversations in Religion and the Healing Arts want to raise is whether there are historical insights that can add value to students within the Christian tradition who seek to understand better the intersections of religion and health. In my talk this afternoon, or rather late evening for me, I'm speaking from Norway, I want to bring this question up in the context of our current situation, where COVID-19 is a major challenge to health and to healthcare globally. I am a biblical scholar, and my area of expertise is the New Testament and early Christianity. One of my particular interests is the various healthcare practices, medical paradigms, and ideas about illness and disability that existed in the context into which Christianity was born, the Roman Empire in the first centuries of the Common Era. I now want to take you into this world of early Christianity. We will look at two stories from the Gospels. In the first, Jesus meets and heals a man with leprosy, and in the second, Jesus is himself accused of being demon-possessed. But let me first give you a brief introduction to medical knowledge and illness paradigms in late antiquity. Next slide. Recent research suggests that in the ancient Mediterranean, there existed two major illness paradigms side by side. On the one hand, there was a popular paradigm familiar to the general population based on ideas of innovation. Within this framework, the gods were viewed as progenitors of illness through various means, including demonic possession. On the other hand, there was a professional paradigm based in the Greek medical tradition of the Hippocratics, which viewed illness as a matter of imbalance. The Hippocratic doctors argued that natural causes rather than the gods caused illness, primarily when there was an imbalance within the body or between a person and its surroundings. Concerning the spread of disease, what we within a modern biomedical paradigm would call infectious disease, we can detect the same two main paradigms. The professional medical writers in general thought that disease could be transmitted to a person from its surroundings, but there were various theories about how this happened. Some doctors thought that the air could contain bad elements, what they called seeds, that emanated from the stars, from the earth, or decomposing cadavers. Other doctors dismissed this theory and argued that it was the climate itself and climatic changes in the seasons that caused epidemics and other diseases that somehow seemed to spread in a population. But most people at this time had not read any medical textbooks. Among the population at large, the notion of pollution was more common. Pollution beliefs can be understood as folk theories of infection. In Greek language, the image of a stain, miasma, was used to conceptualize various forms of dangerous influence. Miasma was perceived as a stain on a community, which needed to be dispelled through some kind of purification. Also within Judaism at this time, there were such pollution beliefs, and in this context, it was connected with ideas of cultic purity based on the purity laws of the Hebrew Bible. You should note that these folk traditions of pollution cast a wider net than the Greek medical theories of contagion. The notion of pollution and purity places contagious illnesses as well as certain disabilities within a larger framework of misfortune or spoiled identity. In other words, this understanding of contagion is not a purely medical category. For example, the Old Testament book of Leviticus speaks of pollution in relation to certain kinds of foods and animals, to dead bodies, birth, skin disease, and bodily discharges such as semen and menstrual blood. In the New Testament, we can see developments of these notions of pollution and cultic impurity that stem from the Hebrew Bible. For example, in the story about the woman with the flow of blood, and in the various stories of Jesus' association with lepers, to which I now turn. Next slide. So in the Gospels, there are several stories about Jesus interacting with lepers. One of these is about a man with leprosy who is healed by Jesus. And I will read Mark's version of this story. A leper came to him begging and kneeling. He said to him, "If you choose, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose. Be made clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. After sternly warning him, he sent him away at once, saying to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, as a testimony to them." In this passage, we can recognize the terminology of purity. Jesus does not heal the man, he cleanses him. And he needs to show himself to the priests because they are the ones who, according to Leviticus, can verify that the skin disease is gone and the man therefore no longer ritually impure. It is impossible to know what kind of disease this man was suffering from. His symptoms are not described, he's just called leper, which places him in a medical but also a social category, one associated with impurity and social marginalization within this context. The bacterial infection that modern medicine has identified as Hansen's disease did exist in the Mediterranean world at the time of Jesus. This is a severe contagious illness which affects the nerves, skin, eyes, and nose, and can result in crippling of hands and feet, paralysis, and blindness. When Greek medical doctors described this condition, they did not call it lepra, leprosy, but elephantiasis, elephant disease. The gospel writers took over the term lepra from Greek translators of the Hebrew Bible, which used this term to translate the Hebrew za'arat, the skin condition described in Leviticus that causes ritual impurity. The description of the skin disease in Leviticus with a white spreading rash as its major symptom is not consistent with the symptoms connected to Hansen's disease. So this man, he may have had Hansen's disease, or he may have had a less severe skin condition, which nonetheless categorized him as ritually impure and thus impeded on his social interaction and access to worship, and may have stigmatized him in other ways. It is, however, unclear how ostracized lepers were at the time of Jesus. From certain stories, it seems that some lepers lived together outside the city in groups, keeping distance to people for fear of infecting them. On the other hand, the Gospels also tell us that Jesus had a friend called Simon the leper, and he attended a dinner party in his house, suggesting that this man led a fairly normal life. In this story, there is compassion, there is conversation, there is touch, and there is healing. Jesus provides access to healthcare in this story, and his attention to people with leprosy echoes how he interacts with other people on the margins of society. By removing the stain, so to speak, he challenges conventions and barriers. The religious movement of Christianity that developed over the course of the next few centuries put healthcare at the center of attention. Early Christian literature is full of miraculous healing stories, but also of more down-to-earth attention to illness, disability, and healthcare, through letters and sermons instructing Christ believers to care for the sick and disabled, and theological treatises drawing on medical knowledge and medical language in the development of Christian doctrine and practice. New Testament scholar Hector Avalos claims that the healthcare system that was introduced by the Christ movement following the pattern of Jesus' healings was one of its most attractive characteristics and factored heavily in its historical success. In contrast to Roman military hospitals, the healing sanctuaries devoted to the Greek healing god Asclepius, or Jewish ritual baths, healing in the Christ movement was more readily available. It could happen at any time, the healers were mobile, the healing ritual was simple, just invoking the name of Jesus, and the cure was free of charge. So what can we learn from this first case? I argue that the tradition from Jesus' encounters with lepers and other people with illnesses or disabilities, which continued in the healthcare practices of early Christianity, make a case for access, inclusion, and compassion for the marginalized. The equal value of every human being as created in the image of God is the basis for any Christian healthcare practice. And today, this attitude actually fits well with the human rights-based understanding of global healthcare. In the midst of a global pandemic, Christians, whether they are healthcare workers or not, can model the concern that Jesus had for the marginalized, how he and his followers offered care in practical terms, and also how they made an effort to counteract stigmatization through critique of established power structures and behavioral patterns. Next slide. My second case is a story in which Jesus is labeled as sick. And I read, "Then he went home and the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, 'He has gone out of his mind.' And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, 'He has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of the demons, he casts out demons.'" In this passage, some people say that Jesus has gone out of his mind, while the scribes, who are Jesus' adversaries, say he has Beelzebul. Beelzebul was the name of a particularly powerful demon in the Jewish tradition. So here we actually see the two illness paradigms that I mentioned in the beginning played out against each other. The expression, "he has gone out of his mind," is a phrasing that the Greek medical writers use when they talk about madness as a physical illness within the imbalanced paradigm. "He has Beelzebul," however, is an accusation of demon possession. In the monotheistic context of Judaism, demons were connected to the forces of Satan, and therefore a stigmatizing label. These two different medical understandings not only had different explanations for the cause of an illness, imbalance versus invasion, they also prescribed different cures. Demon possession called for exorcism, but how did they treat madness? In the Greek medical paradigm, the aim of treatment was to restore the proper balance in the body between the four elements. This was mostly done through a diet and a regimen of rest or exercise. At the beginning of this passage, Mark says that Jesus went home, but that the crowd followed him so that he could not even eat. This suggests that Jesus had experienced exertion and lack of food. When Jesus' family come to restrain him, as it says, perhaps they want to provide treatment for what they perceive as a temporary madness caused by exertion, by giving him food and rest. The description of madness can be understood as less stigmatizing because it did not align Jesus with evil forces. So in this story, I argue that the medical categories of madness and demon possession are used rhetorically to negotiate understanding of Jesus. Demon possession works as a negative charge, and madness works as a defense or alternative physiological explanation for Jesus' behavior. I think that there is also something to learn from this case for our current situation. This story shows how illness categories and labels can be mobilized rhetorically. It is not neutral, what we call a disease or condition. Rhetorical and metaphorical uses of illness and medical language became extremely common in early Christianity. And here, our heritage is not always that positive. Illness became an important metaphor for sin, and sickness and disability imagery was used to label heretics. They were called blind or infected with rabies, and their teachings spread like contagious disease and gangrene. We also see this rhetoric play out in the discourse around COVID. We are familiar with monikers like the China virus, accusations that face masks are introduced by devil worshippers, and more subtle rhetoric that describes the virus as an alien force attacking us from outside. Such rhetoric is problematic because it creates fear and constructs an enemy that is dehumanized and morphed into an invasive, morbid force. Such rhetoric paves the way for racism and xenophobia. Last slide. To conclude, in my analysis of these two gospel stories, I argue that we can find a useful framework for Christian healthcare practices that focuses on compassion, access, and inclusion. But the texts also serve as a warning that rhetoric around illness and religion can be dangerous and should be carefully analyzed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Solevåg. So our second panelist, Dr. David Craig, is professor and chair of the Religious Studies Department at IUPUI in Indianapolis. He's author of Healthcare as a Social Good, Religious Values and American Democracy, published by Georgetown University Press in 2014. And Dr. Craig's public scholarship includes working with 2 Indianapolis churches to evaluate the Healthy Indiana Plan, Indiana's consumer-driven Medicaid expansion. He's now leading a research team of the Monon Collaborative, part of Indiana Clinical and Translational Science Institute. In partnership with Community Ambassador Good to the Soul, the team is convening a congregational learning community, which he'll tell us about, to map health and wellness assets and identify community health priorities to foster new collaborative connections for better health and holistic wellness in underserved areas. Dr. Craig will speak to us now on health, wellness, and the responsibility, learning to connect.
Thank you very much, Susan, for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen, as we are all very familiar with the startup process. Hello, everyone. It was good to catch a glimpse of people in between the PowerPoints here. So I have been very lucky to spend time over the past decade or so exploring moral connections between religion and healing. I've done this with Jewish and Catholic hospitals and with activists who work out of congregations. So my goal today is to share some stories from this research. As Susan mentioned, I partnered with 2 inner-city churches to study the Healthy Indiana Plan. And very briefly, the Healthy Indiana Plan is Indiana's Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. And this particular Medicaid plan requires people to pay for full benefits. And in fact, Indiana is the only state that requires people earning less than $700 to pay for full benefits under Medicaid. So I'm going to tell a couple of stories from my research, beginning with a man who has chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And he shared this story with me. He had enrolled in the top tier HIP Plus plan with the assistance of Shepherd Community Center. They helped him apply for HIP and paid the $12 in monthly contributions for the year for people earning less than $350 per month. But within 5 months, he lost his health coverage. He learned this when he went to the pharmacy and was told that his emergency inhaler and his regular inhaler were now outside of his ability to pay. Under HIP Plus, they were free. And so he said this to me. He said, I was going through the inhalers because they were talking about the pollen, the heat, and everything. And with me having little lung problems, it was hard enough for me to walk from taking out the garbage. And I'd come back in and I couldn't breathe. I grabbed the first inhaler that was there. Sometimes it was the one that I was supposed to take once in the morning and once at night. And then 2 weeks, I'm done with both. I'm calling them up, trying to get a refill, and they said no. So I said 911. In fact, this man called emergency services 6 to 7 times during the 6 months that he didn't have health coverage. He went to the public hospital each time to get an inhaler. And as he said, I got a bill for $2,600 when I didn't have insurance. They're put into a collection agency right now. I'm like, I can't pay that. You're just gonna have to wait. So this is a story that comes from a man on HIP. It shines an unflattering light on HIP, but I want to suggest that it also highlights problems with an unhealthy individualism and a misguided emergency medical ethics that infect how many Americans think about health, healthcare, and health policy. So this emergency medicine ethics, as I'm calling it, has 2 moral assumptions. And the first assumption is that medicine is driven by the duty to save people's lives in emergency conditions. And of course, we see with COVID the importance of this, right? This is one of the imperative duties of medicine. But in the United States, it is such a driver of how we prioritize research, how we construct care, where we spend money, that it leads us to a second moral assumption. And that is this: having met this imperative of emergency care, the job of staying healthy, securing coverage, and using healthcare are largely a personal responsibility. So I want to suggest this is a view that not all Americans share by any means, but infects quite a bit of how we think about healthcare in the United States. And just to sum up, saving lives is the defining duty of medicine. Keeping yourself healthy and well is your responsibility. And we see this in the example of this man who was supposed to pay his monthly benefit. He didn't. So, well, you didn't keep yourself healthy, but we do have emergency care for you because that's guaranteed. Okay. So that's the opening story. I want to share some other stories that talk back to these assumptions. And the first story is from a nun who was a mission director of a Catholic healthcare system. And I interviewed her. And she gave me this memorable phrase, the between and the connect. And I want us to think about this phrase some, but let me set it up a little bit. So talking to this nun, she revolutionized my thinking about healthcare, and she redirected my career toward the local scholar activism that I'm currently doing. In this research project, I asked people who work for Catholic and Jewish hospitals, how do your mission and values shape how you deliver care? And she kind of joked and smiled, and she said, well, you know, hospitals and physicians can be so paternalistic in telling people what health is and how to deliver care. We nuns, right, who historically ran Catholic hospitals in the United States, we nuns have to avoid being maternalistic, thinking we can do everything to care for people. But as hospitals, we can facilitate a heck of a lot. Instead, she said 2 things which were very counterintuitive to me at the time. Hospitals need the community's expertise on health and local health assets. And hospitals have to get care outside the walls of their buildings. And this now seems obvious to me, but at the time, I have to say it was revolutionary. And then she went on to give me an example. She said, okay, here's an example for you. You bring a kid into our emergency room with pneumonia. Not a problem. We can have that kid back on her feet, all fixed up. She goes back to an apartment with no heat. Are we healthcare providers? No, I mean, who's responsible? And then she said, that's the between and the connect. What she means by this is health occurs between healthcare visits, services, and therapies. Health requires all kinds of social supports and services over the course of a lifetime. But many people fall between the cracks without secure access to these resources. And equally important, their support networks may not command the economic levers, social capital, or cultural respect to ensure that their health matters. And so we've got to look at what happens in between healthcare and how do people connect, or in some cases not connect, to all of the things that are needed to be healthy and well. I find this image of the between and the connect very powerful. And in a sense, I've spent the last decade thinking about it and trying to figure out how to act on it. It comes from, in her case, a Catholic concept of common good. This is a phrase that came from the director of ethics at the same Midwestern Catholic hospital system. He said, common good is an infrastructure of well-being that respects and includes everyone and supports each person's flourishing and participation in society. And what I like about this phrase is he's trying to highlight that many important and meaningful goods in our lives depend on what we create together, right? This is why Zoom is so depressing, right? Is we're not there together, creating the energy, creating the meaning together. And I think that's just one illustration of how we as social beings create goods together. But in addition to that, there's this whole infrastructure of well-being that comes through family and friends and universities and healthcare and on and on and on that support common good in our lives. So one of the difficulties, I think, in the United States is when we think about health, we tend to think about healthcare, whereas so much of the infrastructure of well-being is outside of healthcare. And a good illustration of this, and this is a nice slide to show since we have people coming from Australia and Norway today, is the United States is very imbalanced in where we spend money on health spending and social spending. Most advanced countries or most affluent countries fall somewhere along this line. Health spending and social spending kind of work together. But we're an outlier at the top of the page. The US spends far more on healthcare than other countries do. And if you were on the line, you would expect the US to spend much more on social spending. But we are tilted so heavily toward health spending and away from social spending. So this relates to what people talk about as the social determinants of health. The social determinants of health are those things that support us in being healthy from birth through the course of our entire life, work, education, all of these sorts of things. And that's really what I think the nun is getting at with the in-between of healthcare, are the social determinants of health. And this is getting a lot of attention now, as it should. But I want to suggest there are a couple of things that maybe need a little bit more attention as we think about the between of healthcare and how to connect people to good health. So these are some lessons gained from listening to people who are on the Healthy Indiana Plan, and also talking to the dozen congregations in this learning community that we're working with right now. And one of the things that comes through very strong is there's a lot of resiliency in health challenged neighborhoods. People living in health challenged areas are resilient in using and creating community health assets. One of the ways this happens is through congregations. Congregations do a lot of support work in some of these neighborhoods, but neighbors themselves create strategies like informal daycare, for example, or transportation networks, for example. So there's incredible resiliency in these neighborhoods. And I just want to share a couple of quotes that I love. A congregant from First Baptist Church, North Indianapolis, one of our partners who's on HIP, she said, spiritually, yeah, this place is like a hospital. She's talking about her church. And she's talking about some of the things that happen in her church. And this is the pastor of the same congregation. He says, African-American churches calling down through the years required us to have allegiances to these principles of caring for widows, orphans, and strangers. We're supposed to be about the business of resourcing and helping people. That's what ministry is. So a lot of that local resiliency happens by creating these informal networks. But these solutions tend to be local by nature, and sometimes they're limited in various ways. And this takes us to the idea of disconnection. This is the bigger challenge. There's a lot of in-between activity in these neighborhoods, but disconnection is a reality for people. And one reason for that is people are not only disconnected, they're excluded. A police officer made this comment. He said, most of the local businesses in this neighborhood are predatory. Very expensive costs for people who don't have a lot of options. And that's partly because of geographic disconnections. Talking to the HIP members we spoke with, the number 1 and 2 issues they faced were food deserts and unreliable transportation. And then interestingly, after that came social and cultural disconnections. After untreated mental illness, related to our first talk perhaps today, they mentioned the stigma of public assistance, also mentioned the stigma in the first talk, and the stress of racial discrimination and class barriers were very high issues that confront people who are trying to get HIP coverage or trying to access healthcare or other kinds of social support services. So there is a real disconnect that it happens in these neighborhoods. And again, this prevents people from accessing healthcare as well as other social services. So how do we learn about the in-between of people's lives and think about ways to help people make connections? That's really the goal of this learning community with a dozen congregations. 11 are historically Black. And we launched an online learning community. Again, not the most auspicious place to make connection. But some of the early outcomes are that congregations really do have remarkable power to be community connectors, and that partnership strengthens that. So I'm just going to give a few examples of some of the stories that have been shared by the congregations in this learning community. So actually, I'm going to back up one second. So we launched this learning community and asked people to talk about health and wellness in their neighborhoods and in their congregations. And people said, well, there's a lot of diabetes, there's a lot of high blood pressure, there's a lot of heart disease. And we're like, well, what about wellness? Well, what do you mean by wellness? You know, social, emotional, mental, environment. Oh, wellness? Well, let us tell you about wellness. We dance, right? After our online Zoom services, we dance. Does that count? Like, that counts? You know, during our altar call, we hold hands with each other, at least when we're in person, but even virtually, we look somebody in the eye and say, I love you. I want you to survive and thrive. Does that count? Like, that counts. Wellness, as one of our pastors put it, oh, well, social, emotional, mental, and spiritual wellness is foundational to health, and that's what we do. So communities are connectors. They connect people to wellness in powerful, powerful ways that need to be valued. A second way that congregations are connectors is they live out stories in acting on community programs. So one of the groups, one of the congregations in our learning community appealed to this scriptural passage, beloved, I pray that all may go well with you and that you may be in health. I know it, I can't see the slide over here. I know it is well with your soul. I think that's what it says, but I'm being blocked with the pictures over here. But interestingly, this church created the first African-American owned credit union in Indiana. They also have senior housing apartments. They have a daycare. They've been doing wellness for a very long time. They've been doing community programs for a very long time. Another church in our group says, yeah, we're a mothering church, and they're creating a new program for expectant and young mothers. Another church says, we're going to do a Daniel fast, which I was unfamiliar with, but it's a kind of a plant-based diet for the month of Lent, with cooking classes and various ways to sort of bring this different kind of diet in. So these congregations are community connectors in living out their stories. And they're also community connectors because their leaders and members can network and partner with other institutions. And that's really what we're trying to do with this learning community. The university has certain resources, but these community congregations have local knowledge, they have moral authority, they have cultural competence, and they're bringing to the table all of this rich explanation of what's going on between to try to think how we can make a better connect. And so this comes from one of our pastors who says, you know, this learning community is perfect timing because you're helping the African-American community, and the university has resources that we really don't know to look to at first or even know about. And then we are sharing, and that's what it's really about. In unity lies our only hope. So I'm going to stop there and suggest that this is one way to think about the between and the connect. Congregations are connectors. They already connect people to wellness through the kinds of connections they forge internally and sometimes outside their congregations. They're community connectors in living out powerful, moving stories and putting those into action through community programs. And they can be powerful partners too, through the kind of work they do and the networks that they can build. So we're excited to see what comes of this effort to learn to connect, connecting health to wellness and insisting that personal responsibility for health, which is using available resources well, has to happen in a context of community support and programs that support people in doing that. So thank you very much, and I will stop my share if I can figure out how to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. So our third and final panelist is Dr. Wendy Meyer. Dr. Meyer is Dean of Research Strategy at the University of Divinity and a research professor and associate dean for research at Australian Lutheran College, which is part of a collegiate university of divinity schools across Melbourne, Sydney, and Adelaide in Australia. She currently serves as head of the religion section for the Australian Academy of the Humanities. Her research interests include the life and writings of John Chrysostom, the neurobiology of religious conflict and violence, past and present, and the reception of Greco-Roman medicine in late antique Christian thought and preaching. She most recently co-edited with Eric Fournier Heirs of Roman Persecution, published this year, and with Chris DeVette, Revisioning John Chrysostom, published in 2019. In her work for the Lutheran Church of Australia and New Zealand, she conducts research on church worker well-being. One new project on this topic with Professor Sarah Wendt of Flinders University explores the role of religious beliefs in male spiritual abuse in domestic violence. Dr. Meyer will speak to us today on Insights from the Brain, Neurobiology, Religion, and Well-being.
Thank you, Susan, and it's my turn to try screen sharing. So, can everyone hear me? Yeah. So, interestingly, my paper, and I hope this will be the case, intersects with both of the papers that you've just heard. You won't be getting much on the neurobiology itself, so we'll be looking more at the implications of it in religion and well-being. In 2019 in Australia, the Australian Government Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission mandated, as part of its aged care quality standards, what is a very interesting inclusion. For the very first time, amongst supports for daily living, they included the consumer's emotional, spiritual, and psychological well-being. Australia is a very secularized country, and the idea that you would include spiritual care is quite novel in Australian healthcare. So what we're going to talk about first, so I'll divide my paper into two sections. The first is about essentially religion, in this case spirituality, the mind-soul health nexus, cognition and individual well-being. And in the second part, we'll look at social well-being. So to go back to that aged care quality standards, the phrasing itself as a whole is very interesting. So we've already heard from David about how emotional, spiritual and psychological well-being go together as a whole. I'm going to argue that the key here lies way back in the ancient past in the Western view of medicine and philosophy, and not just Western, as we'll see in a moment, as sibling worlds of knowledge, the one focused on the health of the body, the other on the health of the soul. And here we are challenged to look at religion in a much more expansive and less post-Reformation way, as a way of life, not just belief systems, but rituals and belief systems and ways of looking at the world that govern our daily life. So if we go back to looking at a model of how healthcare has been done in the past, we see that from already very early in history, in Asian paradigms as well as Western paradigms, they all have an emphasis on harmony or balance. So we heard something about that when Rebecca was speaking about lack of balance or disharmony in the soul or the body. And we'll see that therapeutics clustered around a whole range of things that we see in modern therapeutics and healthcare. So we see in there surgery and drug therapy, so pharmacology. We also see mind-soul therapy, what we would call psychology in contemporary medicine, diet, exercise, sleep, and we've already heard reference about things like air quality and the idea that the climate itself can impact us. Rebecca also referred to the fact that a large number of those clusters of therapies were called regimen or dieta. So what came to be called after the rise of modern science, essentially alternative therapies. So what's interesting for us is that for almost 2,000 years in Western medical therapy, these large clusters of therapies that are lifestyle related, or what David referred to as the bit that you're responsible for yourself outside of the hospital system, were in fact a core part of medical therapy. And in fact, if we look at writers like Galen, a very large part of his medical treatises are around diet, often plant-based diets, and around exercise, around what we call philosophical writings. For a long time, it puzzled people that he had written so many philosophical treatises that were essentially really cognitive behavioral therapy. So they're about psychological therapy, but about lifestyle as well. So things like why it's important to have balance in the way you live. So simple living is essentially some of the things he advocates about, having very small amounts of clothing and wealth in moderation, everything in moderation and balance. So if we look at how healthcare used to be before the rise of modern science, surgery, pharmacology and regimen, lifestyle-related health therapies were all on an equal spectrum together and part of a holistic system. What happened with the rise of modern science is that because we couldn't clinically or scientifically prove the therapeutic benefits of regimen, the lifestyle therapies, they got discarded, and in the rise of the modern hospital, we end up largely with surgery and pharmacological approaches. However, more recently, we noticed that we have the rise of new scientific experimental results around things like the relationship between the gut as a third fundamental system in the body, as well as the neurological or nervous system and the cardio system, and the fact that that actually has major impacts on mental health, for instance, and that there's a very strong connection between gut health and what happens in the brain. And if we look at the ancient world and the way they looked at digestion, there's a remarkable similarity in the diagrams and the way of talking about the systems of how they understood what happened in the body as a result of digestion, for instance. So if I had a much longer paper, I would talk to you about default mode network, about neurocircuitry and schemas in terms of the way language impacts the brain and our behavior and how we look at things. I would talk about neuroplasticity and how that functions in the body. I would talk about empathy and what that does about how we need to train medical practitioners to retain empathy after they've lost it in their training to some extent, and the mutual relationships between the bio and neurochemistry. So gut health, brain health is what I just talked about. However, there isn't much time, so we're going to go on to religion, cognition, and social well-being. And this is where we merge more into the area that David has been talking about and how we end up with moral framing of our healthcare systems. So what we need to understand here is that, and this comes out of my religious violence and conflict research, is that morality, and here we're talking about social functional morality, not ethics. Social functional morality is the way we make subconscious decisions in the brain, or how they're automatically made in the brain, and how that impacts our decision-making and behavior at a rational level, which always, in this case, neurologically happens after the fact. So we rationalize decisions that we've made at a gut level or affective level after the fact, routinely in moral decision-making. So the important thing about this is the relationship between morality and religion. So morality evolved to foster in-group cooperation. So humans have an evolved predisposition to cooperate with others. They're concerned about their reputations as social partners, and they seek to signal their social value. They're acutely sensitive to the risk posed by cheaters and free riders, and prone to punish those who fail to appropriately contribute to social exchanges. And we see this in the idea that if health is up to yourself, then you don't help people who you believe haven't helped themselves. From an evolutionary perspective, moral systems are means of promoting and rewarding pro-social behavior while discouraging and punishing socially costly behavior. And this can be seen playing out in the moral drivers behind healthcare systems. So morality evolved as an in-group adaptation. Out-group members may stand in a competitive relationship with the in-group. And so as a result, our evolved moral psychology is deeply biased towards the in-group, with the consequent relative moral insensitivity to the out-group. So we instinctively react well towards people and compassionately towards people who are part of our own in-group, but instinctively we have a bias towards people who are not like us. Our moral psychology evolved to function in relatively small, homogeneous groups, characteristic of human society for the greater part of our evolutionary history. And this is important because moral psychology works really well in small groups and small groups acting autonomously. But when small groups meet other small groups, it can create conflict and in-group, out-group bias and other problems. Where religions fit in is that as cultural institutions, they developed to bind communities into socially cohesive, morally bound communities as group size and complexity began to tax our evolved moral intuitions. So as groups became larger, we became urbanized societies. Religion became a mechanism to help groups continue to function in a cohesive way. And as we well know, religion can both work well and it can work very badly, depending on what's happening with the moral drivers at the heart of that particular religious group. So humans are also equipped with cognitive mechanisms for empathy that are bottom-up processes, which function automatically, quickly, and are generated outside of conscious control. Empathy functions as the proximate cause of moral behavior, playing a key role in triggering our moral intuitions. And the reason empathy is so important is because empathy sits at the heart of care and kindness and generosity towards others. If empathy is not being triggered, then our capacity for care is diminished. And another aspect that's important is, I mentioned this before, is rationalization. So this is another cognitive mechanism that it's a form of post hoc reasoning. It's a useful fiction in which the brain makes sense of our automatic actions. So just as individual rationalization can extract useful information from non-rational sources like instincts and habits, communal processes can cohere moral intuitions and norms into the shared useful fictions of shared moral narratives. And this is how groups start to develop behaviors and decision-making that they are absolutely deeply wedded to and that they perceive as moral and just, that may on an actual rational basis be quite unjust and not particularly ethical when this functions in a negative way. In a positive way, it can also help in terms of shared narratives. So the sorts of stories that you hear that create empathy and build cohesion. So one of the key factors behind all of this is moral intuitions and foundations. In the area of moral psychology and neurobiology, there's a considerable amount of work around these 5 moral intuitions that sit at the heart of all of the moral framing of everything that we do. And this is, again, on the social functional level, not on the ethical level. We all know that care is important. We all know that fairness is important. And these are drivers that have particular emotions attached to them. And if you think about what Rebecca was talking about in terms of miasma and pollution, the 5th one there, sanctity and degradation, which is about avoidance of contamination. She talked briefly about how what is started out as a literal avoidance behavior and intuition, gut reaction, turned then into a symbolic one, so that you then start tainting entire groups with pollution or you need to avoid them. Fear is generates and strengthens things like the fairness cheating one. So we talked about the basis of punishing and rewarding people being a very, very primitive mechanism for community cooperation. And interestingly, in some of the neurobiological research, there is a very close correlation between the pollution, sanctity, degradation, or disgust mechanism and the anger, fairness, cheating mechanism. We can see a lot of these playing out in all sorts of ways, and I could talk about all of that at great length and how it can change behavior. But on the positive side, and a lot of this drives the negative behaviors of groups and their moral intuitions. On the positive side, and this is where I'm going to end, an Australian researcher who started out in neurobiology, Tom Edwards, and then realized that it was too stressful a field in terms of the way Australian universities' own value systems drive you to publish strenuously and strive for external grants endlessly, has gone into pastoral counselling as his second career. So he's been working with a mathematician on cognitive virtues and looking at the neurobiology of cognitive virtues. And he's come around to the idea, looking again back through history and all sorts of different societies, Asian and Western, from BCE right through to the modern day, and has come up with the 6 virtues that he believes are fundamental to a flourishing society. So courage, diligence, wisdom. So wisdom, temperance in the sense of moderation and balance. Remember, we talked about that as a fundamental. Honor. So honor is in relationship, in hierarchical relationships, to how we relate to people who are beside us in the hierarchy, above and below us, in responsible ways. Justice, we talked about fairness and cheating, and kindness, again, which fits in with that empathy and care and harm intuition. So I'm going to finish there, but to say that we can explore all of these at great length. They, I think, raise huge questions around why the Australian government, for instance, is willing to insert spiritual care as an essential into aged care, when this is driven by palliative care practitioners, because it, I think, drops it outside of the cure paradigm. You don't have to cure people who are dying, you just have to care for them. And so it changes the whole way that you value your care system and the way you're willing to insert something like spiritual care into that. Australian government is also willing to look at spiritual care in the school system. So for children also, we're willing to look at that, but not in health between schooling and dying, which is a very interesting question. And again, it's interesting that the Australian government is also willing to fund a project in domestic violence where, in fact, I'm using these same moral, intuitive drivers to interrogate men's narratives about their abusive behaviors. I'm going to finish there and stop screen sharing and throw it back to Susan.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. So now we will spend the next few minutes with interactive conversations among the speakers, and then again, depending on time, we'll turn to select written questions from the audience. You can submit a question through the chat function at the bottom of your screen and direct it to the moderators and name which panelists your question is for, and please keep your questions brief. Turning to our discussion among our panelists, I'll just throw out a few things myself here. I'll begin with the question that drove my own curiosity in organizing this colloquium, the question of interdisciplinary connections. Each of you has pointed to really intriguing connections between your presentations, and I hope you'll say more about that with each other. How do each of you see your topics in potential synergy with those of the other two panelists? And I'm thinking here also broadly in the background of many of the scholars and the teachers in our audience. Where could such synergies go? What needs to happen to make them work? And finally, Wendy and also Rebecca, you point us to themes related to moral philosophy, as especially Wendy, and many of our students our first year students this year are exploring texts like Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, issues and my students in a course on the history of medicine in the Christian tradition are very, very interested in how moral rhetoric connects with mental health, especially in light of COVID-19. So I'll just hand that over to you and let you converse as you wish.
I have a question for Rebecca, if I may begin.
Yes.
You talked about how leprosy was a medical and social category, and that these two things go together quite a bit. And then you talked about two sort of trajectories of early Christian approaches to health. One more positive in terms of providing sort of practical efforts to reach out to marginalized communities, crossing boundaries, rejecting demonization, and then the more demonizing language of stigma, illness, contagion. I was struck to hear you say that saying that Jesus was mentally ill was a way of not stigmatizing him, because I think we oftentimes stigmatize the mentally ill today, but I guess if it's the alternative is demon possession, I can see that. But I'm just curious if you could talk a bit more about these two impulses in relationship to what you started to talk about suggestively about COVID at the end.
Yes. How do I approach that? I said a little bit about that also towards the end, that I see some problematic language being used. And I also, I came across this YouTube video a couple of months ago where this mom at a school district meeting said that she didn't want her Christian children to wear face masks because they were developed by devil worshippers, and her children were Christian, so they shouldn't be forced to do that. And it started triggering my thinking about there's a certain amount of religious freedom that maybe we should allow for, but then again, what kind of discourse is that? And how do you frame the situation? And actually, in my opinion, that's like saying that Jesus has Beelzebul in a way. It frames the discussion about this global health issue in a way that kind of demonizes your opponents. And I don't think that that is a Christian way to talk about those things. So this was just one of the thoughts that I've had at the back of my mind while I've been working with this lecture. One of the things that came up in the chat and that kind of connected with what some of the things that you were talking about, David, was there was a question to me about wellness and prevention. And both David and Wendy were talking much more about wellness than I was. I was more talking about illness. And I think that that's a very important aspect. And I think that was in antiquity as well. The focus on wellness was quite clear because it was a less individualistic society than we have today. And that's some of the things that you were talking about, David, is this over individualization is actually not good for anybody's health. We need community. You use the term infrastructure of well-being, and I think that we can see patterns of that also in ancient society of infrastructures of well-being, where one produced health together in community in a way, whereas today, for example, the United Nations defines good health as absence of illness and disability. I totally disagree with that, because I think there's a lot of good health and wellness as well.
Yeah, I will echo that theme. That I think we get tripped up by thinking that health is the goal, right? Oh, I'm healthy. Yeah, well, are you healthy? Well, my back's bothering me a little bit today, you know. And I was injured a couple of weeks ago, or I'm sick in these ways, right? Health is defined by not having a negative, whereas wellness is much more affirming and multidimensional and complicated, and you can be well while you're ill, and you can be well while you're very, very old. And so those themes of wellness, I think, really have to be held up time and time again, especially because the culture just puts the spotlight on healthcare, particularly in the United States. And I do wonder a little bit about, you know, what goes with the different patterns of spending, say in Norway, or in Australia. Is that about group loyalty? Is that about a sense of fairness, trying to avoid harm? I mean, this is some of the language that's used by Jonathan Haidt, for example, Wendy, that you referred to.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to Wendy.
Lost Wendy.
Yeah, I'm afraid we've lost Wendy. Hopefully she'll be back shortly.
But I have a sense that there's more of an understanding of solidarity, say in a society like Norway, that we're, you know, health is something we do together, and we're going to support wellness, and we're going to make sure that people have that, you know, in this, it is more individualistic day than the ancient world, but I would imagine there's some parallels to a greater sense of the infrastructure of well-being.
And a bigger focus on prevention, maybe. Yeah.
I'll share something from that I heard in one of my interview studies from someone who worked for a Catholic healthcare organization, and he said to me, and I was asking him about kind of how does he think about community care, and he said, good patient care is good community care. And there's something true about that. But there's also something very misleading about that, because you have to ask questions like, when in the process does the patient care happen? Does it happen early? Is it preventive? Is it integrated with other kinds of supports? Or is it more emergency oriented? Is it expensive? Is it? And so we do, I think, particularly in the United States, have this sense that we just are caring for individuals one by one by one in these clinical encounters. And that's what good healthcare looks like. And that's what produces good health and wellness. But it's really just not the case that's what happens. And we have to think about this in a more communal and social way.
I'll jump in here with a question that has come up for David. It asks, how do you think the American obsession with meritocracy, or the concept of what the person is calling work to eat, impacts the development of community healthcare, or even the American preoccupation of emergency healthcare versus holistic healthcare? And I can repeat that if you want.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think meritocracy plays a very large role in how Americans talk about healthcare, at least in public, quite a bit. I'll give an example from, again, going back to the Healthy Indiana Plan. So the Healthy Indiana Plan is built to ensure that people have skin in the game because they're making payments, that they have a kind of personal responsibility. And talking to the people we interviewed, well, do you think there should be personal responsibility in health? And they say, yeah, there should be. And I would agree with that too. I should try to use available resources well. That's how I would define it. It's about healthy agency. It's about using available resources well. So there is a kind of personal responsibility here. But the HIP system, and I think this is part of our employer-sponsored health insurance system too, you have to work or you have to pay in to get health benefits, right? You have to pay to deserve it. So this is the meritocracy piece. Some jobs deserve healthcare, some jobs don't deserve healthcare. That's how our system is set up. Now, we may not think that, but that's the moral framework of our current healthcare system. Some jobs deserve health benefits and some don't. And so that's the level of, well, individuals are personally responsible when they're deserving. The Healthy Indiana Plan, if you don't make your payments, locks you out of coverage for 6 months. So this adds another level, which is of personal responsibility of health, is if you're not responsible, you should be disciplined. So we have 3 levels here, right? Responsible use of available resources. Responsibility is being deserving. Responsibility requires being disciplined if you're not. And I think that this is really a problem that we see in COVID right now. There's a bit of a pervasive talk in the air, which is, I'm not worried about the pandemic because I've made healthy choices. I'm not worried about the pandemic because I've been responsible. But the implication of this is the people who are worried haven't been. And that begins to add a kind of moral distancing to our social distancing. Social distancing is one thing, but moral distancing is something very different. And I hear a lot of moral distancing happening in the rhetoric around COVID, even if it's spoken in a kind of positive, I'm not worried about it, right? Mindset. So I do think that plays a significant role in how discourse around medicine and healthcare happens in the United States, both around coverage and around COVID. I guess I have, in terms of I think the emergency care is, well, we're not going to let you die, right? But we're also not going to invest in other kinds of care that might do a better job of keeping people well.
Yeah, this issue of distancing is so pervasive right now. And yesterday, actually, in our class, we were looking at an article by Denise Buell, actually, who talks about microbes and the connection between microbes and humans and environment and the world, and asks the question of how do we avoid this polarization? How do we then welcome the other into our conversation, into our midst? How do we not make this a larger polarization? And I think this is a big question. I mean, how do we use COVID in a way that it actually promotes healthcare and not increased distancing as human beings from the world?
There has also been some really interesting kind of ethical issues that have been raised around COVID. In particular, I think that we saw in the spring some really, there was such hard pressure on hospitals all over the world that, for example, in Italy, they started putting an age limit to how old people could be to get into a hospital. In Sweden, they decided on this herd immunity way out of it, which really has caused a lot of deaths, so many more than here in Norway. But in Norway too, there were issues where people who had disabilities or needed breathing machines were taken off of them just to make sure that COVID patients could have a chance to get them. And there was the governor of Texas, or lieutenant governor of Texas, who came out and said that older people should be willing to die for the US economy. So there are some, the COVID pandemic has really also put some of the ways that we globally are thinking about access to healthcare and who deserves access to healthcare more or less, really kind of pushed some scary buttons, I think, in that discussion.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote from Pope Francis that I can't put my hands on at this moment, but around that whole same time, he basically said, you know, people are more important than the economy, when there was this big tension between how do we choose?
Yeah.
A couple of other questions that have come in, I will just throw them out there. Someone asks, are practices aimed at physical wellness perceived as religious? And another question, I think for David, when talking to local congregations, how did their responses connect to healthcare and hospitals and not just spiritual health?
Can you repeat the first question again?
The first one, are practices aimed at physical wellness perceived as religious? This may be targeted to Wendy, who we still seem to not have among us. Again, we're trying to find out where she is.
I'll toss something in response to that question. So I have a colleague named Andrea Jan who writes about yoga. And she's got a couple of interesting books and a new one out, Peace, Love, Yoga, but also a previous one, Selling Yoga, where she argues that yes, yoga is religious for many people, even if they don't see it as religious, right? That there's a kind of religious quality to the discipline and to thinking about how yoga creates wellness in your life. Now, she says it's very much associated with what she calls a kind of consumer religion, which is a religion focused around sort of personal improvement, and where the body is kind of the central metaphysics of doing well and being well. But I do think that for many people, physical wellness does take on that kind of religious quality. I don't know if you have something to say about that, Rebecca.
This might be a little to the side, but I'm thinking about this whole notion of religion being a set of beliefs, which is kind of a very Lutheran Protestant way of thinking about religion. Religion, historically and in many other traditions, is a set of practices, ritual practices, physical practices, dieting practices. So that divide isn't always as clear as we might think it is.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I really open it up to the audience. If anyone has questions, feel free to write them in the chat. Email me if you feel like you absolutely must speak your question. We can make that happen as well.
I'll just quickly respond to the one question too. So the people I speak to in the congregations do think a lot about how they connect to hospitals, think a lot about how they connect to clinics. In fact, that's sort of the number one question that's on their mind, not surprisingly, because that's how we tend to think about health and healthcare in our country. And sometimes there's a lot of distrust of hospitals and healthcare clinics. These are African American congregations primarily. African Americans have had a very long history of being excluded from healthcare in the United States. Many African American hospitals were created in the early 1900s because African American doctors weren't allowed to practice at the other hospitals, most of which were religious, Protestant hospitals, some Catholic hospitals at the time, but also just African Americans have been historically subjected to all kinds of medical experimentation without consent, from the development of obstetrics in the 19th century to the Tuskegee experiments with syphilis in the 20th century. So there is a deep distrust, and that comes out very clearly talking to people in congregations that are African American. And so the question becomes, how do you sort of rebuild some of those ties? And that's clearly a place that healthcare providers need to do some work in going out and learning about the lives of people, the in-between of people's lives, right? But also the sources of distrust. And I think this comes up a little bit around the discussions around wellness that we have. Wellness is about eating well, and diabetes is a problem. And so certain cultures of food are frowned upon. Well, where did those cultures of food come from? You know, they have a history, and the slave diet was a diet for a particular reason, which is there wasn't access to other resources. And so they're very complicated histories that have to be unearthed in trying to think about how to build strong connections between the congregations, in our study at least, and some healthcare providers. And I should also say that a lot of the people in these congregations are professionals themselves, right? They work at these institutions too. so they're very much in the corridors of power too, in a way.
So David, how would people outside the neighborhood or outside Indianapolis help or support these communities, or how can learn more about them, learn more from them? Because it seems like a model that needs to expand, unfortunately, sadly.
You've asked the whatever $1 million question that I'm asking these days is so we've started with this dozen congregations, and they're talking together and learning some about their neighborhoods, because a lot of these are commuter congregations. But that's the question. So how could we build this? We're going to be doing a project in one of my courses in the spring where we're going to adopt local congregations, and we're going to ask them, how do you understand health and wellness? How do you support health and wellness inside and outside your congregation? And try to create a kind of wiki, a visual wiki that we can create a living document to sort of build out different ways that Hindus and Muslims and Sikh community understand health and wellness, in an effort to try to build a growing coalition of interest. There's a group called the Center for Interfaith Cooperation that's interested in this. Healthy Indiana Plan creates an interesting opportunity, which is nonprofits can pay people's contributions. So we're actually going to try to create a fundraising campaign to raise money from congregations to cover people's HIP contributions to keep people on the Healthy Indiana Plan. So we see this as a way to try to say to people, look, let's invest in all people's health and wellness. And you can do it through lots of diverse traditions. These are some of our ideas, but I'd love to hear other people's ideas.
It's such a challenge, because how do you find the balance between the let us donate to underwrite the problem that's going on versus how do you change the system?
Yep.
And we're delighted that Wendy is back among us again. Thank you.
Yes, apologies, a major internet dropout in Australia.
So Wendy, there's been a number of questions. One was asked, are practices aimed at physical wellness perceived as religious, that I think you could address, but I also wanted to give you more time to say whatever might be on your mind that we would have benefited from while Australia was out of power?
Right, well, actually, it was just my campus, but anyway. So the question about physical practices, what was
Are practices that are aimed at physical wellness perceived as religious?
Okay, so there's a really interesting question there, because one of the reasons I was looking at that whole holistic idea from both traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine and then Greco-Roman medicine was around the issue of mindfulness and meditation practices. So we know that these have become extremely prevalent in contemporary Western society and usually divorced from the religious aspect of them. So mindfulness is, as we know, a kind of stripped down Buddhist meditation form that has a lot of research, clinical research attached to it, brain imaging studies that look at the actual physical impacts of mindfulness meditation on well-being. And it's particularly used, we know in the UK health system, it's on the National Health Scheme as payable by the state for depression. And in Australia, it's being investigated for its use in chronic pain management, particularly by the New South Wales government, and the question of whether it should also be putting on the National Health Scheme as something that the government pays for you to access. And so the question is like, what is the benefit if you reintroduce the religious or spiritual aspect of it to the physical aspects of meditation is a really interesting question, and one I think that has a lot of fruitful research ahead of it. The answer is we don't absolutely know, but it's very suggestive that because, as David was saying, this is about connection with communities. We think of mindfulness and meditation practice as very individualistic and very self-centered, but we also know that people go to gyms. And during COVID, this is one of the things we've observed in Australia, is people have gone religiously to gyms because that's their community. And it's that connectedness that matters as well as the physical regimen that you're doing. And so there are very interesting questions around all of this, around the religious aspect, or what we might call religious. And the question is whether we want to look at it in terms of modern concepts of religion as organized, usually belief practices and rituals that go together, that have structures, or whether we want to look at religion as a less structured thing that is more about a way of life that has a spiritual and faith-based dimension, often with some kind of moral code attached to it, that's an ethical, conscious moral code. So that, yeah, there's very large questions around all of that.
There's this term that I want to bring into the conversation, which is religious citizenship. And it's kind of the flip side of what we've been talking about, where Wendy was mentioning that spiritual care and well-being is taken into the Australian notion of care for the elderly or for senior citizens. So how do we, if it is so that religious communities is a good source of well-being and health, then people with disabilities should have access to this. And religious citizenship then needs to be part of disability rights in a way. So that's something that I've actually been working on myself, and co-edited a book in Norwegian about religious citizenship, and it's a term that is beginning to be in use, but I don't know if it's a term that any of you guys have come across before.
Can you say more about how it is connected to disability rights?
So the term citizenship is often used in kind of human rights related talk about what your rights are as a citizen. As a citizen, anyone, no matter what their abilities or disabilities are, should have access and be part of the society that they live in. So as an aspect of that, access to a religious community should also be part of it. So that would be a religious citizenship.
So
that's interesting. Sorry, go ahead, Wendy.
I was going to say that's interesting from the aged care perspective in Australia, because that particular clause in aged care standards, it goes on to say that in the next clause that it's about connecting people in aged care, and here they tend to conceptualize it as institutionalized aged care. So when you're actually in supported living or in a nursing home situation, that you have a right to be connected to your religious community. And that therefore the provider must make sure that you have that access and that you are connected into that. And I know in discussions with aged care chaplains that they now see that as a large part of their role is any faith person, that they help them to stay connected to a larger community outside of the institution that they're now in which they're receiving the physical care, and that's a fundamental part of their well-being and care. However, again, it's totally constricted to aged care. It's as if somehow we recognize that our aged citizens have these rights, but there's no thought that anyone else needs these rights or that might be a fundamental part of their well-being.
Yeah, that's interesting. A PhD student in my PhD program actually has written his dissertation on how people with cognitive disabilities who live in institutions don't have access to the religious communities that they feel that they are a part of. So this isn't done well enough, I think, in many communities around the world.
It also affects how churches open up and other religious communities open up during the COVID era. Because I know a number of churches that are continuing to meet by Zoom on purpose because many of them simply wouldn't feel safe if they were meeting again in person.
Yeah. So in a way, the way that we have started doing church during COVID has led to, in some aspects, of better access, but also there are other problems connected to that, of course. But that is quite interesting. It's also easier for a wheelchair user, or there are many people who have actually had better access to church services in this period.
However, the question is it quality access? And I think this comes back to something that David said about connectedness and real connection. And I was just talking with one of our mission directors in the Lutheran Church yesterday about their experiences with spiritual care and worship during COVID. And their argument is that people are connected with more people, but not necessarily in a quality way. And it comes back to that human interaction creates relationships in ways that virtual interaction doesn't.
I've heard something interesting from some of the congregations in this learning community who talk about how they don't have that same level of connectedness. But one response has been to do parking lot services. So people drive in their cars and you do a parking lot service. It's not that connected still, but at least it's something. But he went on to say something that this actually felt like it opened the doors of the church to the neighborhood. And he had people from nearby say, oh, I was listening to your sermon the other day. And this is actually motivating them to think about ways that they can reach out beyond the walls of the building once social distancing is over. And to try to think about some more creative strategies for doing that with different communities, both neighbors, but maybe other communities that have a harder time making it to services. So I think it is a possible moment for new innovation too, in interesting ways. Yeah. Rebecca, have you ever written about the Pool of Bethesda story, which
yes,
as a theme that would be near and dear to your topics?
Yes, I have. And one of the things, I actually had a thought on that story while you were speaking, because when Jesus asks, this is the story in John 5, And when Jesus asks this man, do you want to be made well or something, what he answers is, I have no one. So this is a man without a community in my reading. And I think that he is the most destitute of all the disabled characters that we meet in the New Testament. There are other characters who seem to be part of a community. For example, the 10 lepers that Jesus heals. They're a community of 10. The blind man that Jesus heals in John 9, he has a synagogue and he has a mom and a dad who can speak for him, or who actually says he can speak for himself. But this man actually says, I have no one. And that is, to me, kind of the saddest utterance in the New Testament.
Well, I'm very mindful that it's after midnight in Norway at this moment, yes, and our time is fast coming up to a close. So once again, this event has been recorded and will be available online for sharing more broadly. As we conclude today's colloquium, I hope that you will all agree that our panel of scholars has invited us into a glimpse of just a few places where the study and practice of religion and spirituality can intersect with aspects of healing and wellness in our world today, and how that might productively contribute to building wellness, flourishing, and global health. So for all of us now, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Solevåg, Dr. Craig, Dr. Meyer, for your work, your inspiring vision, your wisdom, and for being with us today. Thank you so much.